Something dark and scary.
Now, son, this is how to make a pumpkin into a beautiful jack-o'-lantern. Christopher Landis said to his 8-year-old son. Joseph watched in amazement as his father carved a crude smile into the pumpkin that sat on the newspapers lining the table. "Wow," Joseph whispered quietly as Christopher placed the candle into the jack-o'-lantern and then placed the top of the pumpkin back into place. Christopher smiled and said in his best supervillain voice, "Just wait until it's lit." Joseph giggled and followed his father outside. Christopher placed the pumpkin onto the front porch step. He darted up the stairs to grab the grill lighter. He clicked it on and lit the jack-o'-lantern. Yellow and orange light glowed around and inside the gutted and slashed pumpkin. Father and son stood in relative silence as they watched the jack-o'-lantern burn bright. The flame danced inside it like a kite on a windy day. In their yard were many Halloween decorations. It looked like a classic horror graveyard. There's plastic white praying angels, cross headstones, and the classic round-topped headstones with rest in peace insert name on the face of the stones. Some of them were the ones with faces and light-up eyes. The praying angels had large wings and sad faces. They had androgynous faces, as not to discriminate any gender, which made them creepier, because you weren't sure what pronoun to use if they were real angels, and that they might kill you if you were mistaken. Christopher turned around when he heard his wife, Maya's car horn being beeped in a way that was provoking. It was locked. "Hey babe," Christopher said, smiling cheerfully. His tone held much love for his wife. His biggest thought was that Maya and himself would be able to get alone time once their daughter Maria arrived home. "Are you excited for tonight, Chris?" Maya asked, gently grabbing him below the belt. Chris flinched lightly, grabbing Maya's arm as he looked at Joseph, who was still staring at the jack-o'-lantern. Chris smiled and nodded his head. 2 hours later, twilight was approaching, and Maria Landis was finally home. She pulled up into the driveway, then sat for a little while, admiring the Halloween decorations. It was foggy out, and she looked at the fake graveyard that her parents had set up on the first night of October. Tonight was Halloween. She looked at one of the angels. This one looked different to her, more realistic. There was blood, burn marks and rips all over its white hooded jacket. Its hair looked as if it were made of shadows on a new moonlight. Its eyes were glowing a bright blue, ghostly blue. The skin tone on his face looked wickedly pale, yet crackly and covered with gray and red sores. It puckered around where it looked as if someone had cut its cheeks open from the lip corners to the jawbone, a crudely cut grin. It looked horrible. It also had several blue stains on the face and jacket. Its hands were covered with black and leather gloves. It wore black pants and shoes that were black with white stripes. Maria smiled at it, finding it creepy but fascinating. She then looked at one of the other angels, which looked like a classic praying stone angel. It was white-skinned, feminine and masculine at the same time. Its eyes glowed red from the obvious lid-like pupils. Maria was confused now. She looked back at the hooded angel. Its head was now tilted to its right. Maria then got out of her car and walked up to it. She saw a puff of cold, foggy air form around its mouth. She looked up at its eyes, which felt as though they were locked on hers. She slowly reached her hand up to its mouth, inch by inch, what seemed like forever. She noticed the angel had only slits for a nose. Shortly, her hand was less than an inch from its jagged lips. Just as soon as she gasped from the hot breath that she felt on her skin, her arm was seized tightly. The 16-year-old girl screamed, and looked away as the smiling angel laughed at her with such a wicked roar, and saw that it was holding a large knife now. The angel swung its blade at her arm. Maria clenched her eyes in agony as her screams became more shrill. She felt the cold still deep in her flesh. It shot pain throughout her entire arm. Her fingers twitched rapidly. She shook her entire body as the creature lifted her up by her arm and began slicing off the flesh of her arm where it started. She was screaming and sobbing now as she bled. She heard the chunk of her arm plop on the hard plastic platform after it slid from her limb. The sound of it came to her, and it was a slimy, sticky sound. She spat out some of the blood that flew into her mouth and started involuntarily laughing. In her panicked state, she couldn't help but join the evil angel's maniacal cackling. It swung again into the arm as it continued giggling. She looked up at the attacker's face. The eyes were filled with anger, and its mouth was open so wide the cut smile no longer looked like a smile. It looked like a canine's mouth ready for a bite, but it was shaking with angry, shrieking laughter. Maria mirrored him with panic and pain-shrieking laughs as tears and blood streamed down her face. Suddenly, the piece of flesh that was whittled off her bone in the midst of her painful laughing fit had just plopped onto her tongue. The angel that was killing her quickly placed the tip of the knife under her chin. It spoke in a voice. It sounded like an insane man that should be locked up. The angel who had her at knife point now said, "Eat!" in the most rage-filled voice she had ever heard. She complied and began chewing her own flesh. She would not stop her panicked giggles between swallowing. The killer fed the girl her own flesh. She was high on the pain and fear that she felt. The shock made her mind like jello. The angel was male from what she could manage to guess by his voice that roared from its mouth. She screamed with one last laugh as the angel pulled the bone out of her socket, out of the gooey red stained meaty flesh stump that was her shoulder with a violent shake. Her final screeched laugh was cut short on the impact of her head landing on the ground first, snapping her neck. Her body made the puddle of blood that formed around her make a sickening splatter as she landed in it. Inside the house, Chris, Maya, and Joseph were watching some movie with a killer in a shitty William Shatner mask stabbing teens in Illinois. Joseph wasn't scared at all. He was 8 years old, but knew reality from fiction. He decided he didn't believe in monsters at 5 years old. He was a smart kid. Chris and Maya laughed nervously as their youngest child kicked his feet as he was giggling on the floor at the people being gruesomely murdered on screen. Maya loomed at her watch and said to her son, "Hey Joey, why don't you go put on your Grim Reaper costume? Then you can grab the candy and start handing some out before it's your turn to get some with your sister." Joseph turned around and said in a nervous voice, "Okay, Mommy, this movie is silly anyway. And please call me Joseph when you're in public. I want to sound cool in front of the girls." He then smiled and skipped down the hall. Maya and Chris looked at each other and giggled. "That kid's going places someday. I once heard him say to his toys he's going to change his name to John and that he'll direct some really good movies," Chris said in an amused tone. Maya snickered and replied, "I don't doubt that. I think he's being held down by staying in middle school." In Joseph's room, the young boy was putting his costume on and working on his evil laugh to scare the kids who wanted candy. He put his skull mask and hoodie on, and in that moment, he heard what sounded like a man falling. He looked over to see a deformed, grinning creature with slit nostrils and eyes as blue as a phantom. wearing a burnt and bloodied white hoodie. It was a pullover style jacket rather than one with a zipper. Thinking it was just a costume, Joseph said to the crazy looking person in his room, "I like your look, it's very cool. I'm not sure why you're in my house, but there will be candy with me on the front porch if you want any." The deformed, smiling person bowed his head politely and said with an unusual stutter, "Candy from Death himself? This is a true honor. I will see you in a few minutes, sir. I'm going to surprise the mom and dad in this house with all the candy in my pocket and a story while you're out there. So act like you never saw me, okay?" The little boy that is dressed like a Grim Reaper just shrugged politely and walked out the bedroom. The deformed man smiled and pulled his knife out of his pocket. About the time he exited the room, the front door was being shut. He waits for about 5 minutes. From the living room, the killer heard a man and woman laughing and making noises of pleasure. He chuckled softly and made his way to the living room. There in front of him are Maya and Chris sitting side by side, hands down each other's pants. Piano music can be heard from the TV. The killer clears his throat, and the couple flinches as they look up at him. They forgot about the recent murders that have been going on. "You're Jeff the Killer, aren't you?" Chris says nervously. "My name is Jeffrey Manson, sir. But I guess you could call me that," the killer said as he quickly slammed his large knife into Maya's mouth and shoved it through the back of her head in one fatal swoop. She uttered no sound but a choking noise, and then the unmistakably croak of death. Jeff grabbed Chris by the face and pulled his head back as he slid the blade swiftly under the man's jaw. Blood spurted out in front of Chris. The blade was caked thickly in blood of different shades of crimson. Jeff the Killer now walked to the front door, opened it, and saw Joseph waiting for people to come. "Hey there, Death. The mommy and daddy liked my story enough that they wanted me to give you this," he said, tossing the blade onto the kid in a way that kept him from getting cut. The blood that coated the blade got all over Joseph's costume. Jeff grabbed the bowl of candy and pulled out some Twizzlers and some black licorice and began to walk down the steps. He looked over his shoulder and said dryly, "Go to sleep, kiddo. I'll tuck you in some other night." Jeff started to walk away again, but stopped again. He turned around and grabbed out the candy bowl, a Snickers bar, and said, "You know what? I think I'll tuck you in now." He opened the front door and pushed the kid inside. The kid held on to the blade. Jeff grabbed the hand holding the knife tightly and put it under the kid's chin and yanked it sharply to the right. The last thing the killer screamed before everything faded away was, Go to sleep."